Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Radical Respect podcast. I'm Kim Scott.
And I'm Wesley Faulkner. We're changing it up today because we're going to talk about leadership and someone who's able to share stories about actually being accused of bias, which is really, really impactful for our audience. And so I'm really excited for this conversation. Kim, could you do our introduction?
Welcome, Elizabeth Blass. Elizabeth is a two-time Chief Customer Officer with over 15 years of global leadership experience in the technology sector. Known for her unmatched energy and positive leadership, she has a proven ability to transform early-stage companies into market leaders. She specializes in bringing and scaling high-performing customer-facing teams, aligning cross-functional initiatives, and driving revenue growth through customer success. During her nearly 14 years at Verizon, she gained deep expertise in customer success and operations at scale. Elizabeth holds a master's degree in strategy, management, and leadership from Michigan State University's Eli Broad College of Business. A passionate advocate for diversity, she actively coaches and mentors women in technology, empowering them to excel in leadership roles. Welcome, Elizabeth. I'm really excited for our conversation.
Thanks for having me. Since we met at the Women's Summit, I've been really looking forward to having this conversation.
Yes. And so you and I had a great conversation at the Women's Summit in Austin. And we were talking about how hard it is as a leader to get some feedback that you have been disrespectful in some way, whether it's bias, prejudice, or bullying. So I would love, you had a good story. Can we start with your story, or do you want me to go first, or Wesley?
I'm happy to go first.
All right, let's do it.
Okay. So this was about 10 years ago. And I was emailing with one of my teams, and my response back to them was something along the lines of, I feel gypped. And carried on, of course, didn't think anything of it, was completely aware that it was a harmful phrase until one of my team members...
Completely unaware.
Completely unaware.
Yeah.
Completely unaware, yeah. And later that day, I received an email from one of my team members, and the subject line said discriminatory language. And I can remember it like it was yesterday. I thought, oh my gosh, who used discriminatory language? I'm going to address it immediately. And I scanned the email and realized that he was explaining to me that that word is considered offensive due to its roots and ethnic stereotyping. And once I realized that I was the problem and that I was the one that used a word that was really offensive, I just kind of went into this mode of defensiveness and completely fixating on the wrong thing. I actually forwarded that email to his manager and said, it is not okay for this team member to use in the subject line of an email, which could be searchable, discriminatory language. This is overly harsh. And I'm really offended by that, right? And, just completely, there was no self-reflection in that moment.
Yeah.
It was days later, it may have been a week later, that I let myself, fully read his email. And in it, he respectfully explained the origins of the word, how it's rooted in discrimination against the Romani people. That word, kind of casually tossed around, reinforces harmful stereotypes that my team member was brave enough to address with me. As you call it, institutional courage,
Yes.
that he had. And I think I just, I'm a leader who I'm really intentional with my words. I try to be aware of bias. I felt called out, and that was what I fixated on. So, I think about it often. That team member is a great guy. He's someone who I do keep in touch with, and that's all okay. But I absolutely regret how I handled it. I think I'd do better now. I think the embarrassment would still be there if I was, called out on something that I hadn't gotten right. Maybe I'd feel some shame from that. I think I'd be more open. But wow, I really handled that poorly.
Well, thank you for sharing the story, because it's it's hard. It's really hard to admit when you've gotten something that you care about so deeply getting right when you've gotten it wrong. And it was the thing that I struggled with more than anything else in writing Radical Respect is sharing those stories about times when I was the one who was disrespectful, when I said or did something that was either biased or prejudiced or bullied others. And I don't like, because it's so not how I want to be. It's not the person I want to be. And so, first of all, thank you for having the self-awareness and the courage to share the story, because I know those are hard moments.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes me actually want to reach out to him, all these years later and just say, how because I think about it every so often, do
Yeah,
you remember this interaction and how did
yeah,
you feel in the moment? And I think he's pretty bold. I don't think it was probably a situation where he thought about it a lot that day and wondered if he should send the email. I think he pretty confidently sent that email. But for some people that would be something they'd really have to weigh the pros and cons of, do I tell the person? How do I tell the person? So I just
yeah,
that kind of makes it worse in terms of the way that I reacted.
yeah,
Yeah, and what a gift to have it in writing too, so that you could go back, you could reference it, and in a conversation when emotions are pumping, then it's hard to focus on what is being said instead of how you feel. And so I know that you had that reaction, but you also had the other reaction of revisiting it. So that was something that it wasn't just you did something wrong, but they sound like there was research and some information and references to make sure that the whole value of what that word means to other people, seeing it in a different light. That was not just work to bring it up, but work to make sure to bring it into the reasoning for that decision to put it in an email.
yes, yeah. And I will admit that until you told the story, I was unaware of the etymology of the term. So thank you for telling me so that I don't make that mistake, because I'm sure that I've used that as well. Wesley, did you know?
Yes, I did know. I actually had I think at my um, niece's birthday party, I ran into someone and they used that word because we are trying to register at a climbing gym for the birthday party,
Uh-huh.
and I think there was one of those games that I think wasn't functioning correctly and took some money, and I was talking to this person and they used that phrase, and I said, just let you know that that's an offensive phrase and
Yeah.
it is blah blah blah. And they were like, no, it's not. I use it all the time. It was one of the one of the things that was, and I was like, well, that doesn't, I mean, it's still, and she said that, well, I'd never heard that before. And it was just living in the river of denial of
Yeah.
just repeatedly just trying to uh, avoid any reflection, and also feeling that me bringing it up was just actually changing the mood. It's making it more serious, and
Mm.
it was supposed to be a celebratory like birthday party. And why am I being like a word
Oh
cop and all
gosh.
this stuff?
Yeah.
And so it was a very difficult conversation, one that I eventually dropped because it was more of a distraction than a point. I made my point.
Yeah.
And my part was done. But one of those things where it's just like, I wish conversations like that were easier.
Yeah.
And
And
it's kind of sad.
there's so many other words you can choose too. Like I'll say,
Hmm.
I feel shortchanged, or I was
Yeah.
wrong, or there's lots
Yeah.
of other words that you can use. But what do they say? You learn and you do better. So
Yes,
Yes.
yes, when we know, we do better. I think that the response, I wanna go back to your story, like, when you first realized it was you who had used discriminatory language, like, where did you I can tell you where I would have felt it in my body. When I get feedback that I've said or done something that harms someone else, I get like a tingling in the back of my knees. It's a physical fear response. It's the same physical feeling I get if my children walk too close to the edge of a precipice. And that I think that's how I feel shame. I feel ashamed is what I'm feeling. And that's how I feel it in my body. And one of the things that I've really tried to do since writing Radical Respect is to be aware of that. Like because when I feel ashamed, I rarely respond well. I often respond badly because I feel like I'm physically defending myself from a danger, and my executive function has shut down. So I'm curious to know how you felt when you realized that it was you who had used discriminatory language.
It's such an interesting question. I think I felt it kind of the way that I would when I feel embarrassed, where you just feel that instant heat, or your
Yes.
face is turning red, and just like you feel it, you feel like you're kind of you're burning a little bit.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think it was largely an embarrassed feeling.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that when I feel that way, and especially if I'm in a position of some power when I feel that way, the instinct is to do what Jennifer Fried calls to Darvo. Deny, I didn't do anything wrong, attack the other person. How dare you?
Yep.
And then play victim. I mean, poor me, And that is a very awful, but also a very human instinct when you get accused of having, or get feedback that you had, not accused, but when you have in fact harmed someone with a disrespectful attitude or behavior, it's easy to fall into that kind of. And if for folks listening, if you're not familiar with Darvo, you can Google, and we'll drop it in the show notes. You can Google Darvo South Park. They have an excellent video about what Darvo is. So one of the things that I try, and I would love to get your all's thoughts on this response instead. One of the things I try when I get that kind of feedback that I've said or done something biased, I try to instead say inside my head, not out loud, but inside my head, I say ack. And that has a very specific meaning, 5 A's and a C. The first A is to be aware. Like it's my intentions don't matter. The fact that I wasn't aware doesn't matter. Like ignorance is no excuse. It's my job to educate my own damn self. It's nobody else's job to educate me at this point. Secondly, is it's really important to acknowledge what I did wrong and acknowledge it as publicly as possible. But it's often, I think, part of the reason why leaders fail to acknowledge what they did wrong is that they're trying to avoid the consequences. So you just have to accept the consequences. There might be some kind of penalty that you have to pay. Just pay the penalty. Uh, and maybe even go beyond paying the penalty to make amends. Do more than just accepting the consequences. And only after you've done those things does it make sense to apologize. And then, of course, you've got to change. You've got to try not to use the same word over and over, and that can be hard. I will admit that there's a word that I use that several people have told me several times that is a problem, and that it's still, just the other day it slipped out, where when someone does something that disappoints me, I will say, "Oh, that's lame," and that's another word like that, an ableist word that I know better, and yet these deeply ingrained habits of speech. Wesley, what are you thinking? I feel like I'm appalling you that I would
No,
say,
no, no. It's just that I hear the same thing when people say that's crazy or that's
yeah,
insane.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
one of those
same
terms.
kind of
Yeah.
thing, same kind of thing.
Even you guys.
Yes, yes, that one is like nails on a chalkboard for me. But it's easy for me to say y'all because I grew up in Memphis.
Yes.
That's what I grew up
Yeah, I
saying.
can't pull that
I grew
off.
up in Texas.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But you can say folks. But these deeply ingrained habits of speech are important and also hard. Like we need to be persistent with each other and patient with ourselves, I think.
And call it out.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was curious for the story. It seems like there is a possibility of two lines of harm. One was the original utterance of the word, and the other was the reporting of the employee to their manager. How did you go about to make amends or address after the fact?
Yeah. Yes, I mean, as a leader, right? It's the worst thing to be like, you just don't want to look bad. It's unfortunate that I kind of went into self-preservation mode. And it was, back in the day when we were in an office, I was able to, that next week when I was kind of going through and rereading his email, I was able to kind of go out and pull him aside and just say, wow, I read your email. I'm so grateful. He, of course, I mean, he will now, if he's listening, know that I, had reacted so badly and sent this email to his manager. But she and I had a conversation about it as well. And I kind of reviewed with her how I felt, but kind of how I felt about it was a little irrelevant. And that I again appreciated, like, this is so brave of him to have called it out and to make me aware of it. So I covered that with his manager, and then also just with him individually, just letting him know how grateful I was to be aware, and that I appreciated him taking the time to explain it to me.
Yeah. Yeah. I will share a story about a time when I did something I was ashamed of and reacted. I mean, I have several, but reacted badly. There was one time, it was actually as I was writing Radical Respect, and I was giving a talk to at a university, and I was sort of previewing some of the material, and somebody asked me a question, and I was telling a story about a time when an HR leader told me that I intimidated my team. And it was so hard for me to see myself as to notice. Sorry, there I'm going to wave a purple flag on myself. I did not think of myself as intimidating. And in the talk, I said, I'm short, blonde, and Southern. How could anybody? And someone raised their hand and said, how could you have just said what you said, given what you're talking about? And I didn't at first understand what what she was responding to, because I was so invested. I mean, I have my lived experience, and I hadn't thought about the other side of those stereotypes. Like, and she fled the room, and she was in tears. Understandably, she was a tall Black woman, and I didn't in the moment understand, and rather than going through those, being aware of what I did wrong, and acknowledging what I did wrong as publicly as possible, accepting any consequences, like maybe I wasn't going to be able to finish the talk, we had to talk about this. I didn't Rather than making amends, I just rushed to apologize. And my apology seemed to everyone in the room like a brush off, which apologies often do seem like. And I remember I got home, I just curled up into a ball. I felt terrible, but at a certain point I realized, like, why am I curling up? Like, I need to go out and make amends. I need to, like, get up off my ass and understand what I did wrong and educate myself and then go make this right, but it's hard to get the feedback. So I don't want to, like, you know, uh, I want to have some compassion for myself. And at the same time, I want to hold myself accountable for doing better next time.
It's also a difference in terms of getting tough feedback privately, which, as you can see in my story, is still very hard, or publicly.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think as a leader, you have to accept that you're going to get publicly, one of the things I say in Radical Candor is you're the exception to the criticize in private rule. You have to
Yeah.
accept gracefully public criticism as a leader. That's like part of why you get paid the big bucks.
It's so
Um,
interesting in your story in that moment, because that's a lot to have to process with an audience and on stage. And when you already
yes.
have, a prepared
Yeah.
talk, and then it takes a turn like that, that's a lot to process for anyone.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying it's easy, but, like, that's part of one's job as a leader
Yeah.
is to learn
Unfortunately,
how.
you probably get a lot of reps in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, in particular, given what I was writing about, it was kind of unforgivable that I had such a, but actually the experience, like all hard critical feedback was very valuable for me because that was really, it forced me to think much more deeply about how to respond. That
Mhm.
was actually when I started coming up with this act for like, it's not enough to apologize, you've got to do a bunch of things before you apologize.
Yeah.
So it was helpful. I don't know. What about you, Wesley? What do you what should I have done differently?
No, I mean, I see it. It's when you're uncomfortable. One of the first things in terms of your body's response is like, I want to make this feeling stop. So it's
Yeah.
very
Yes.
internalized because that's the one you're most aware of. And then moving into kind of like either empathy or compassion of the other person is kind of where it should be redirected to. And
Yes.
it takes a lot of discipline and practice and awareness to be able to move that energy from internally feeling to externally of like, how do I try to extinguish their emotions on how in terms of the thing that I kicked off, the thing that I started within them, and take accountability for that. That is really hard, really hard to do. And I don't think it's necessarily natural or something that is the instinct of a lot of people to do immediately in terms of that order. And that is the same reason why they say in the reverse, when you're a parent and you're flying with a child, to put on your mask first.
Yes.
It's almost the same. They have to repeat it because it's going against your natural instinct. So you have to keep saying this mantra, this framework, this thing in your head in order to use it as a tool. And if we don't have the vocabulary, it's hard for us to be able to do that. So I agree with even if the apology is hollow, I think rushing out to apologize at least put the intention there.
Yeah.
So it kind of is the opportunity to kind of like halt the
Yeah.
the situation and say like, at least let's stop this right now, to say
Yeah.
that let's start try to address the harm,
Yeah.
which is great. I mean, I think that's better than nothing. It's better than doing the opposite and doubling down, which is
Yeah.
also sometimes reflexive.
Yeah. It was really interesting. I read this book called On Repentance and Repair by Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg. And she talked about Maimonides, who was like a 13th century rabbinical scholar. And he talked about what we how to respond when you've hurt someone, and he warned also about not rushing to apologize, like, and the fact that the other person doesn't owe you forgiveness, which is really interesting. One of the things that really made me come back to that experience I had where I was given the talk. I was chatting with someone had who had been sexually assaulted in the workplace, and the guy who had assaulted her kind of came up to her in a class in a conference room, stood between her and the door, so she was alone in there, stood between her and the door and said, "Forgive me," you know? And I realized that, I mean, this is obviously a very different situation, but my apology had been kind of the emotional equivalent of that. I was like, "Oh, I didn't mean anything. I'm sorry. Let's move on." Like it, and every time I'm tempted to apologize too quickly in order to move past something, I think about, like, I don't want to be that guy standing between the person I just hurt in the doorway saying, "Forgive me." So that was like another thing that I think about that all the time.
It's interesting. In a past company, I was responsible for business continuity. And something that we spent a lot of time doing is mapping out what are all the things that could go wrong and how would we all respond to it, right? Everyone knows what business continuity is. And I'm just listening to your story and the different, approaches. And as Wesley said, like, it's so hard. But most people, I mean, as leaders, right? Like, we all have examples because we learn as we go through, but it's almost like there needs to be like a radical respect, continuity, plan where, you can go through some of the different examples that are out there, and how would you respond so that I don't think it wouldn't make it easy, but it would certainly maybe equip leaders to at least have a little, I don't know, muscle memory or some experience to draw upon,
I think that's a really good point. I mean, I feel like if we were not leaders, but soccer players, we would be doing drills. We would practice, these different, and we wouldn't wait to be in the game to practice this.
Right.
We would do it in advance. And I think that with leadership skills, everybody hates a role play, but I think we need to practice this stuff because it's so hard, and it's also counter instinctive. Our instincts lead us the wrong way.
Yes. And I think humans are notoriously bad at estimating. They're notoriously bad at projecting into the future possibilities. And then you couple that with the Dunning-Kruger effect, where their lack of harm, meaning that they haven't experienced a lot of harm, makes it so that they feel like they have a good sense of the type of harm that's out there, even though they may not. And so when you couple those two together, it's almost like, why should we go through all this work when there's low chance that any of this stuff would ever happen? And the things that they don't realize is that maybe it does happen often, but not in the way that they've experienced, not in the way that they are purview to. Yeah. And so their estimation of even putting in the work to do the pre-mortem of ways that things can go bad feels as if it's a wasted exercise or expending energy in something that will never get used. And I think both of those two happen often.
I think that's really, what was the something?
Dunning-Kruger?
Yeah. I don't know about this. I need to learn.
The Dunning-Kruger effect means that it's a study, and it's been those are the two researchers that found that the people who know least about a subject feel more confident that they know about it.
Yes.
So ignorance is something where they like, if you ask someone who's ignorant about a subject, they're like, yeah, I guess I pretty much know that. And then you ask someone who's a real expert, and they're like, I'm trying to grasp it. I still got some of it, because they understand the vastness of it. So they understand how much they don't know about it, which is different than the other person. Yeah,
that's really interesting. It's funny because one of the things I found is sometimes I'll be, I'll post something on LinkedIn or whatever, and somebody will write to me, oh, that doesn't happen anymore. And, like, oh, bias, that doesn't happen at my company. And I'm like, oh, come on. But sometimes I think, are they trolling me, or do they really? And invariably, if I respond kindly, I realize they're not trolling me. They actually really believe that. And then I share something, and they're like, "Oh my gosh!" Like it's really surprising. But how denial's a big deal. We got a lot of it, especially when we know.
And we have a situation with that information is not wanted, right? It's also denied because of people like that, so that people are reluctant to share because of the air of denying is so strong with any victim of bias or other types of harms,
or even physical violence. I mean, I was talking to this guy, and he said, I'm tired of being sexually suspect. Like, I would never rape a woman. And I'm sure he wouldn't rape a woman. I said, look, I'm sure that's an uncomfortable feeling. But if I go into a conference and there's 100 men, I'm going there because I want to get to know some of those men. I want to professionally get to know them. But there's one of those men, roughly, I mean, who knows what the number, but let's say one, who is actually a serial rapist. And I don't want to hold the other 99 sexually suspect, but I also don't want to get raped. So help me out here. Like, help me identify. Like, the answer is not to suppress knowledge of this stuff when it happens. And I think something similar for, I'm white, and I was not until I started writing this book, to my shame, I wasn't as aware of how frequent racism, if I were Black, I would be experiencing racism on a daily basis, and I should have been aware. I should have known, but denial it's shocking, really.
Yes, being uncomfortable is not popular. Being uncomfortable is not popular.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so that was a depressing note to end on. Let's figure out a more cheerful, optimistic, what can we do? I think that here's the optimism I'm going to pull out of this conversation. Elizabeth, you made it right. You realized what you did wrong. You went to the guy, you thanked him, you went to his boss, you explained to her that you had been wrong, your initial, like, that took a lot of courage. So thank you for being a great leader. And it also took courage to tell the story. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm definitely going to get in touch with him and see how well he remembers this. I'm curious to hear his side of it.
Also, you now put DEI in your bio, which is, this is not just something that happened. This is something that's deeply like part of your kind of personal identity now, of being able to say that this is something you want to be aware of and you want to make others aware of. And even being on this podcast, it is something that allows you to not only take that learning, but also try to help with the awareness of general diversity, equity, and inclusion amongst other groups. And so that is something that's also a big positive of the story.
Thank you. It's important to talk about, right? We all learn together.
Yes,
Yes,
absolutely. And that also is reason for optimism. We do all learn together, and we work together better after we learn together. So thank you so much for joining us. Where can people find you?
Probably just look up Elizabeth Blass on LinkedIn. I'm there often. And
BLASS, Elizabeth Blass.
BLASS, yes.
All right. Thank you so much. Really great conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.